some really interesting sessions on ethical responsibilities of museums. So welcome. We're not going to get into too much just until people have a chance to join us. But it's nice to see some faces. I see Julene is joining us, who just finished speaking in your session. Hi, how are you doing over there?
Doing very well, yeah.
Yeah. Has that do you get the post-presentation nerves, or do you feel a little bit relaxed?
Oh, I feel much better after.
Absolutely. Well, that was a fantastic session. So it's really nice to have you to join us for this conversation. If anyone else who has just presented, I'm not seeing the full list. If anyone who has presented this afternoon is also with us, I'm going to borrow Adriel Lewis's idea of throwing some ones in the chat. If you want to just throw your name in the chat so we can see who else who's just presented might be here, that would be lovely. And Marty, you've been attending a few of these sessions. Which ones did you get to?
I went to it was accessibility with Prime Access, and then cognitive accessibility for cognitive with Christina, and both were fantastic.
That is awesome. Well, we've got at least a few of our presenters are here joining us. It's excellent to have you here. I was in one of our sessions, so I will be able to speak to some of that. We're going to really have a few minutes thinking about ethics in a broad sense. For those who joined us for the introduction, we spoke a little bit about ethics and museum ethics, as some museum theorists have thought, and we spoke a little bit about technology ethics. Marty's going to take us a little bit more thinking about corporate ethics and social responsibility. We're going to spend a few minutes in that place, and then we'll go into a broader discussion. For those who don't know me, my name is Suze Anderson. I'm an assistant professor of museum studies at George Washington University. I am a white woman. I'm currently sitting on the floor with a grey background and a guitar. It looks like I'm artistic. I am not. I have a black sweater. I have long feather earrings, and my hair is in an attempt at a quiff, because my baby has been ripping so much of the front of my hair out that there's nothing else I can do. And I'm coming to you from Baltimore, which is Piscataway land, the unceded homelands of the Piscataway peoples. And I think that's really important to acknowledge. Marty, why don't you introduce yourself? Also, just before I flick to you, we're going to ask people who've attended sessions today to think of two things. I'm going to present you with a couple of challenges, and we'll get to you. I'd like you to think about what questions occurred to you as you listened to your sessions. What are the things that you thought, oh, here's the thing I'm still thinking about? What are the questions? We're not racing to answers. We're going to hold questions in our head for this session. And then what are the themes that you noticed from multiple sessions? How do they connect? What are the ideas, the big ideas you're noticing? And how do they start to make connections with your own practice? So I'm going to pop those in the chat. I'm going to pass over to Marty, but there's some things I want to challenge you as you're joining us to start thinking about that we might want to bring up and bring in everyone's voice in a little bit.
Thanks, Suze. My name is Marty Spellerberg, and I'm light-skinned, male, dark hair, in Texas, broadcasting from Texas, and I am sitting on a sofa. So I wanted to share just a couple of slides before we get into the discussion. Just a little bit of context. I'm doing a business degree right now, and I thought it might be interesting to share a little bit about how ethics are talked about in that context. It was certainly different than how I had experienced it before. So this is the pyramid of corporate social responsibility. I mean, to me, it seems super basic, right? But apparently this was a big deal when it was first introduced, that companies at the beginning were focused, and they felt that focusing only on the economics was appropriate. And then this framework was developed where you go beyond your economic to your legal responsibilities. You go beyond your legal responsibilities to your ethical responsibilities, and you go beyond your ethical responsibilities to your philanthropic responsibilities. So, I mean, to me, this seems pretty basic, but you know, it was a big step when it was proposed. A couple of just vocab words. To moral intensity and moral or ethical sensitivity. Moral intensity refers to a situation. So a situation could have moral intensity, where some situations are more fraught than others. The example I heard is, well, I don't know, you know, it's people throwing different types of things at their car. If someone throws a cigarette butt out their car, you're probably not going to maybe think, oh, maybe they shouldn't be throwing their cigarette butts out their car. But if someone shoves a person out the car, I mean, oh man, that's terrible. The moral intensity of that situation is much higher. And then the moral or ethical sensitivity, that's within a person. So different people have lower or higher sensitivities to moral situations or ethical situations. So those are the two. One is the situational factor, and one is a characteristic of people, of individuals. And then I wanted to thought I would share these principles. We're often encouraged to look at situations through these different lenses. So one might take an ethical situation and then analyze it using these are 4 principles. There's more out there. There's no shortage of them. Philosophers continue to develop these ideas, but when confronted with a situation with moral intensity, and you want to analyze the ethics involved, you could look at it through different lenses. And by looking at it through different lenses, you may come to different conclusions. And then at the end of the day, you have to reconcile those different conclusions. But it's these are tools to help you think. And I would be curious if to hear, you know, we all we attended various sessions today, and I would be interested to hear the arguments that were presented in the sessions, analyzed through various lenses, and whether one would come out with different conclusions.
Marty, can I just get you to read out what those different
Sure.
of lenses are, so that for someone who might not have screen reading on?
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
So utilitarianism, this principle says that the only moral obligation is to seek the greatest good from the greatest number of people. Number 2, individual rights. This principle says that everyone has the same set of natural rights, such as freedom of movement, physical security, freedom of speech, and fair trial. Distributive justice. This principle says that the benefits and burdens of similar individuals should be the same. Otherwise, they should be proportional. Ethic of care. The ethic of care principle states that everyone has a moral obligation to help others within their relational sphere to grow and self-actualize. So here we are. So we would like to have it. We'd like to discuss what we saw today.
Yeah.
Suze, do you want to take it?
Sure.
Take it back.
So as I say, it would be lovely as we get into it. We're going to talk about some of the things we observed, but we'd really love to hear from participants in various sessions, as well as people who were watching, listening, absorbing this. Help us unpack this together. And we've got some things we'd love you to do is ask questions that emerge to you out of these sessions, and themes that you've noticed, big ideas that you've noticed, and how they might connect with your own practice. We'll look at both the chat and also people can raise their hands so that we can actually bring you into the conversation. So I was in a session thinking about risk and ethics for museums, and then I attended the building accountability session. And for me, with both of those sessions, I think a lot about if we think about accountability, for instance, coming up to the question of who is making decisions for whom, for the institution, and who decides levels of risks, who decides levels of public engagement, thinking the building accountability session, and I might pass to someone from that session in a moment, that was really thinking about Black Lives Matter statements and what institutions put public statements out, which ones didn't, and then what kind of follow-up happened as a response to that, and trying to keep institutions accountable. And it really makes me think, when we think about ethical practice within this space, who is defining risks, who is defining the publics at stake, that ethics writ large are meant to help museums and other institutions maintain the public trust. But a couple of questions that I started to come up with was, who are these publics, which publics, and how do we then decide, or who is deciding whose concerns get prioritized? So for me, that became a question that I was thinking about, and I've been thinking a lot about in my own practice. Marty, what did you hear?
I went to the session on accessibility, and Sina made some very strong points that I thought were interesting to consider. He talked about accessibility. He talked about there's a method for accessibility, but he didn't like it as a method. He thought it was bigger than that. It was more of an axiology, and that to say that it was a method was he asserted that it was essential to all of society, and I thought that really got to a moral imperative, an ethical imperative that I would love to unpack a bit more, to really locate that imperative. He said compliance with the law, thinking about that pyramid, said compliance has nothing to do with inclusion. It barely does anything about accessibility. So when we're thinking about, there's the legal compliance, but then up from that are the higher levels of the pyramid, ethical compliance. And I think his point there sort of touched on that. And then in the cognitive disabilities discussion, one of the phrases I picked up on was be the voice of the person who's not in the room. Again, speaking to who's in positions of leadership and who's making these decisions.
Yeah, Marty, these questions of who I think are really essential. Seema brings this in. Seema, would you like to unmute yourself and join to make your point?
Yes. Hello, Suze. Hello, Marty.
Hello.
I've been hearing, we were in a SIG one, and it comes up in actually a lot of the ones I've listened in on. At every point, somebody says a conversation like, we chose X because of Y group. So it's either, and it's not the same group. Sometimes I hear these choices, we had to make these choices because of the funder or because of the visitor, or we had to make these choices because our staff couldn't or our staff could. I think it depends on what part of the organization you're in, or where the money's coming from, but it kept happening in each instance in a different conversations. But it was interesting to me that often I did not hear people say that this was an ethical choice. They said they knew we're making a choice and there was ethics in it, but it's interesting that it did not come up often as a lens that was ethical, but it is really 5 people versus 100 people. There are numbers and there are ethics that are associated with it. And somebody else added to that conversation in the chat, but I have a hard time chatting and looking at people's faces. So whoever that was, I'm sorry.
I saw that you had pointed to Aaron Richardson. Did you want to talk a little bit more about this idea of the public trust and that being different from this idea that the public trusts museums?
Sure. So I'll just use my go-to. I have some go-to sort of crass analogies that I like to use. I have a long history of teaching graduate students, and sometimes you just have to get the point across really quickly in a way that is not shocking, but I don't know. You can. So here's the public trust analogy. Like the public, in terms of collections, right? We hold the collections in trust for the public, which is the same idea in my head as, you know, assets being held in trust for a minor. So if you're you know, if you are a kid and your assets are controlled by trustees and you want to buy a Ferrari when you turn 16 and the trustees are like, no, that's not an appropriate use of your assets, and you hate them, they're still acting, you know, as trustees on your behalf. They're doing the best thing for you and your assets in the future. But whether or not the public thinks we're telling the truth is a different matter. And I find it very interesting that we don't, I like what Seema just said, that we don't talk about ethical choices. And I think if we did, it would make some of our choices a lot easier to justify. And it would remove a lot of the fear and risk around some of those choices. So for example, if we said, we are going to hire a diversity and inclusion officer because it is the ethical thing to do right now, that would really clear it up for board members who don't think we need to do this. Are you going to have an ethical debate in your board meeting? Maybe, but I feel like it's less likely if you just state what you're actually doing is coming from an ethical place.
Can I push back on that though?
Yeah, do it. Do it.
I feel like the time in which we live and COVID shows that the ethical thing to do is to ask people to wear masks and ask for you know, proof of vaccination or negative COVID test, whatever. And I know there's many, many institutions that don't want to even address that as ethical because it impacts bottom line or it impacts, you know. So I feel like we're living through this example of, even if it is ethical, even if that is said out loud, it doesn't matter.
Mhm.
I wish I could disagree.
I would agree with Julian. I think that we should, but I think it actually does not make it so that the argument stops. I mean, I just today had a conversation where I said, do you want to use this word? Because it will start an argument. And it was something about, and I remember like being more equitable about something we were using, and space or something. And I was like, you know, equitable is a real trigger word for some people. Are you ready? Like I will go to any fight my staff wants, but if you're not ready, I'm not doing it with you. And I think ethical is another thing. Like I often say, is this the ethical choice for us internally? But I don't say it externally because I'm not ready to start some of those fights. I have a lot of them to do.
Seema, it's interesting hearing you say this. One of the things, so I teach a course on museum ethics and values, and I ask my students, so it's exclusively, almost exclusively focused on contemporary practice and emergent issues. So we look almost exclusively at what are the things coming out of the field today and how do we think about them and contextualize them. And one of the biggest things that I ask my students to do in that is not to race to the answer that feels comfortable, as in we should do this, but to sit with the uncertainty of, well, why isn't this happening? Because I think when we do think about these ethical challenges and when we think about technology ethics, very often it's so easy to say, well, we should do blank, but there's all of these reasons, including stakeholder pressures from funders, including board level pressures that I think Julian is getting to, including the fact that we're trying to make sense of multiple publics and their needs, and that they're not all the same need, that sometimes they're in direct conflict. That coming to the ethical answer is not a straightforward thing. And that even thinking, Julian, you mentioned like masking. To me, that's an obvious answer. But if you're wondering, well, does our institution survive if we risk whether people will come, and then there becomes a reputational risk. And what happens then? Are we acting in the public trust if it turns out people lose faith in our institution in one way? There's multiple things that we're having to balance there. And so how we navigate those frameworks, I think, is actually at the heart of a lot of this discussion. Marty, how do you, in business school, because I think business school likely comes to this from a different framework than I think some aspects of museums, how would you be encouraged to make those decisions? Is there a sense that one framework is better? What is the process that you're encouraged to take?
I will say that there's an ethics sort of component of each of the topics that we're studying. They all come back to those four principles that I presented. I've seen that list of principles several times in this process, and it's just to do the analysis, to sit down and do it. To look, to say, and the idea that you're going to come out of each of those analysis, you might come out in a different way. And then it's up to you, as then having done that analysis, considered it, then you make a decision, but you at the end of the day, you probably do have to reconcile them, because they're not all going to come out the same way. Through one form of analysis, something may be ethical, and through another form, it may not. But I think just having those conversations and carving out the time to say, we are going to do an ethical analysis here. That is part of our process, is to do this analysis. And you could assign different people to take different positions, have a little debate session about it. And but I also thought it was interesting, like with the corporate responsibilities, I'd never encountered that in museums before, and I wondered if it was because museums are always located, the entire organization is located up in the philanthropy thing. And do we even think of ourselves as, we might critique companies out there and be like, oh, what a ethical or an unethical company. But I think we just take it for granted that because we're doing things in the public trust that we are behaving ethically. But of course, if we were doing that, if I was doing that, I shouldn't anymore,
Yeah, I'll tell you, if you asked my students who are presented with 14 weeks of museums because I bring them the problems of museums, it's a very depressing course, and I'm really apologetic to my students, because actually, if we look at what happens in the field, there are so many cases that lead to uncertainty. And in a lot of ways, if we think about the codes of ethics that we live by, at the moment, there's not really any that exist with technology, and that can be helpful and not helpful depending on what that leads us to. But it's so interesting, sort of, I think potentially there is an assumption that because museums are understood to be or thought to be, there's many good people doing many thoughtful things and trying to do really good things in this field, whether that does bring this assumption of, do we naturally feel like drawn to ethical approaches? And I'm not sure that we could argue that. Something I'd love to see, someone's talking about museums uplifting ethical values. I think, Francis, do you want to speak to that? Because I think that that's a really interesting question. And I'd love, Seema, also for you to unpack this idea of ethics of the past in a second. But Francis, can you speak first?
Hi, just a second. I have to get my camera out. It's pointing at the ceiling. Hi. Yeah, my comment was just a feeling that sort of ignoring the ethical questions is business as usual. So the whole reason we are in a situation where we have to decolonize, the reason that we have to face issues around collecting only white European artwork in major art museums, and all the issues that we're facing now are the way museums have worked since they were started. And so I think that, you know, it's easy for a lot of senior management, even in the face of all of the questions that are coming out, to just fall back on business as usual at the highest levels, to maybe, you know, sort of talk the talk, but not walk the walk about making the kinds of changes that I know, and certainly in many cases the staff want to see. But it would involve losing power. It would involve losing collections, changing in ways that I think a lot of museum senior leadership are not yet ready to change. So I think it is business as usual. That's my thinking.
Yeah, it's interesting. Max, I think this is a really good question. Max just wrote in the chat, I wonder if people are thinking of ethics in board recruitment. A couple of things that I think about a lot, and I'm going to throw to Gretchen in a second, because there's some interesting conversation points she just made as well. Something I talk about a lot with my students is there's this gap between board concerns and staff concerns. I saw an observation, I can't remember who, unfortunately, a couple of years ago on Twitter, from someone saying that so often the discourse that happens in the field, that there may be a shift that happens within the field and within the sector that then is not continued or sort of perpetuated at a board level, because there is a strategic there's a gap. And so the strategic direction of the institution gets set by the board, at least in the US, and that the people on the ground who are doing a lot of the work, they might have very different understandings, because this is where discourse develops. This is where our understandings of ethical practice develops in a lot of cases, is through these kinds of conversations. And these spaces are happening quite distinct from the conversations happening at the board level. And that might be why we have some of this disconnect. Gretchen, you had a point a moment ago. Do you want to speak to that yourself? Gretchen might not be here. So Seema, I am going to throw them back to you and talking about ethical issues related to making change.
I am. I was just muted. Sorry.
Fantastic.
Right. So in looking at both the kind of the top down, or the structure that was shown where philanthropy was at the top, and then there were ethical and at the bottom economic criteria, or looking at the four principles, ethical kind of frameworks. I still think, given today's issues, that there are these kind of, male, white, kind of cis constructs that are lurking behind these, that we don't call out because they're just normal. But I think people who are questioning a lot of these, how museums operate in general, are thinking about issues of gender and race and other ways in which the field just does not reflect who the various publics are. So I'm wondering, Suze, for example, in your class, do you talk about, this word intersectionality, is often kind of mocked as being, kind of a jargon, but it is so relevant in terms of the interconnection of all of these various issues. So I'm wondering if you get into that in looking at these various principles. And I'm wondering what other people think about these kind of normative constructs that I feel are present but unnamed.
Yeah, I mean, we absolutely talk about those ideas, because the whole purpose is trying to unpack the complexities of the field for us, of trying to, for us, it's trying to get to the paradoxes at stake. Because I think that if we try and understand why change isn't happening, it's to try and understand the levers of pressure that are happening in different spaces. So it's thinking about funding and money and the implications that that has, but it's also thinking about board makeup, and it's thinking about staff makeup. It's thinking about how institutions deal with trauma and who might be affected in those conversations. And that's what we try and do, is sit with this uncertainty, but also use that to unpack how and why certain practice happens.
Mhm.
But it's hugely complex. And I think that's one of these, the questions when we think about ethics is, if there's an assumption or even an idea that ethics is straightforward, I think that we actually almost, it makes it harder in some ways, because then you say, oh, this should change, but without going, well, why isn't it changing, and trying to understand how those levers of power work and where these things come up against one another. And in a moment, I'm going to throw to Marty to sort of wrap us up and talk about some next steps and some through lines we've seen from last year. But something I wanted to know from anyone who's attending is whether your institution has mechanisms for identifying ethical questions and ethical issues, and if so, what the processes are that you have established as an institution. You know, I've long wondered why grant makers, for instance, don't require a section on the ethical issues at stake when you're applying for a grant. I think if that was done, we'd probably have different discussions in the field if there was money tied to how you're dealing with and addressing ethical issues at an institutional level. But I'm not aware of any grant like funding bodies that are doing that. I'd love to know if anyone does, but I'd also love to know what internal mechanisms you have for thinking about and reflecting internally on ethical questions. Does anyone have anything established within their institution? Also, I have an infant crying. If you hear that, I apologize.
I would love to see that, but I don't know where it exists. I guess one thing that this conversation, I'm going to digress a little bit, that I'm hearing from both you, Suze, and Aaron, as individuals who are in academia teaching about museums, the ideals that I think all of us here working in museums, like, yeah, we'd love that. That'd be great. Like, of course we should have that. But like, I have to solve the problem of, you know, so-and-so's membership isn't updated in the system so that they can't register for the program that they want. Maybe today's just a bad day, but it feels like so much is in between us and that ideal, that it just makes me a little bit sad and bitter to even think about it. But that's my reality for today, everybody. I need to raise my window and get my rainbow spinning back in the room. So.
Max, you just said you feel like you're teaching to the ideal all the time. Julian, I will say my optimism and my joy actually comes from teaching, because when I'm in the classroom, I feel like the students that I'm seeing, the emerging professionals that I'm seeing coming through, are thinking about and grounded in realistic, as much as they can be when you're still emerging in it, understandings of practice, and idealistic, and figuring out a space in there. Max, do you want to speak about teaching to the ideal?
Sure. I mean, like, one of the courses that I teach is learning in museums, right? And so I talk about the importance of how to plan for educational experiences and who you're serving, and like being equitable to your audiences, and trying to figure out like how not to, like, I kind of start the class on like, we've been crapping on people forever. So like this is what you have to fight against to get to the point where you can just reach people, right? And invite them into your experience. You know, and so you know, we talk about like these plans and these great things and these wonderful like constructs and frameworks for learning that people can do, but then, well, they're going to go out to these museums and they're not going to have that, right? Like, they're not gonna they'll have these things in their heads about like, well, this is the great thing that we need to do, and they're gonna go and they're gonna fight for those things. Great. And I keep telling them, this is not the ideal, and I mean, this is the ideal, and you need to fight for what is the ideal out there, because you're gonna go out there and it's not gonna be like that. So that's what I mean by that, is that I'm kind of acutely aware of like the things that we're talking about tend to be so you're trying to train people to go out and do the best work, right? But like at the same time, it's like I keep trying to fight against that sort of like false sense of I'm telling you how it is rather than how I think it should be. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it absolutely makes sense. And I agree. As an aside, really, really great credenza or whatever it is behind you. That's off topic. For anyone who can't see it, it's beautiful and geometric, and it's delicious. I'm gonna step back because I think this is a really fantastic conversation, but I also want to go back to Marty, because we need to think about how we continue this conversation in this space, because what we've seen over the last couple of years is this through line of people having conversations around ethics at MCN that come up once a year at a conference, and we don't have mechanisms for extending that conversation. So Marty, can I throw that to you?
Yeah. So to talk about the through line for me, and probably some of you were in ones prior, but out in Denver, we had a roundtable 2 years ago. We had a roundtable. It was called Nightmare Machines. It was one of the offsites, and it was about tech ethics, museum tech ethics. There's an essay that came out of that. It's on the Slack. I can send that around. And then last year, we had a roundtable at last year's conference. I pulled some of our notes from that, and I won't do them justice. Some of the themes, but it's in the archive, right, in the MCN archive. But some of the themes from this discussion last year, we talked about persuasive design, which is an area of design practice that endeavors to influence human behavior through design choices. We talked about the digital divide. We talked about data privacy. We talked about how we choose vendors. Are we making responsible choices when we choose our hosting or our ticketing systems? We talked about participation in social media, ethical implications of engaging on Facebook, forcing the adoption of those platforms upon our publics, the impact on staff. I have a note here that was Nikhil's part. He had an amazing section of that discussion. I won't do it justice, but he talked about surveillance allowing platforms to sell their ability to influence our thinking, and he suggested an action of demanding people over profit. But that's just to say, so this conversation that we had today is in this thread. And last year we definitely talked about it. How do we keep this from being a once a year thing? And then this year we talked about it. How do we keep this from being a once a year thing? So in the last few minutes, maybe we can have a little bit of a conversation about what does this ethical conversation at AMCN look like, in the 12 months between now and next MCN. And I'm going to drop a link into the chat, which is just a simple Google form asking for people's email addresses. And that's if anybody wants to continue this conversation in that format, and just so that we can be in touch with people, feel free to fill out that form. It's just sort of an extra, but I'm going to go and get that link.
I'm going to say, Aaron just said, does AMCN have an ethics committee or SIG? No, but if you fill out the form, maybe we can start one. You amazingly led us to the place we wanted to go, or at least I wanted to go.
I'm so easily baited. Oh.
Because actually it is this question of how do we start coming up with what might be a code of ethics, what might be just a continued space for these conversations where people can actually identify and talk through specific issues with others who are thinking about them deeply, and having an ongoing space for that. Coven had done some great work, Coven Smith, with others around the Muse Tech Charter over the last few years. The Muse Tech Charter was thinking about ways that we can approach the work that was thinking within an ethical framework as much as anything. But I'd like to, there is interest, and there's been interest for a few years. It's just how we connect these ideas and these people. That's kind of the challenge we'd like to leave for everyone as well. Max is putting in a plug for meeting up in speed networking at 4 p.m, which sounds great. Does anyone have final thoughts? We've got about 5 minutes. I want us to honor people's time and end on time. Does anyone have final thoughts before we wrap up about any of the sessions that they saw, or about this continued conversation?
I just want to reiterate a thing I put in the chat, which is congratulations to all you smart people for being willing to talk about ethics openly in a conference setting. It doesn't happen in other conferences. So everybody should pat themselves on the back.
I think MCN as an organization, as a community, has been doing a really good job over the last few years of bringing this in. So we, Marty and I were lucky enough to help participate with this session, but there's so many people who've been doing this work for years that I think we need to acknowledge, because I think MCN as a community is focused on thinking of the ethical ramifications of the work that happens here. So yeah, it's lovely to be part of a group that are thinking about that and thinking about it so actively. So I'm going to say thank you to everyone who has come, all of our presenters, to today's sessions, everyone who is thinking about this. And there are other sessions throughout the program that are also thinking about the ethical aspects of their work. They just might have fit into a different framing better, or might have fit into multiple framings. And I think for all of us, as we think about how we get to ethical deliberation within our own work, part of it is thinking about who you can draw upon for these ethical conversations as well, that it won't just happen within your institution, although hopefully it is happening there in some way, but how we support one another through these conversations, because that's where we'll develop a language, a set of ideas, and really test out different outcomes. I think I'm done. Marty, what about you? Any final thoughts?
No, yeah, thanks to all. I'm really glad. I mean, it was so easy with what gets submitted to MCN to have a day about ethics. That was really, really wonderful. I think really, again, thank you to all the presenters and everyone who came before and everyone who will come after.
Yes, I can't wait. I ask someone in this room to step up to lead this conversation next year, because it should be a conversation that continues in whatever shape. So yes, continue to do this work and think about it, and think how you can connect with us, or how we can support you, and how we can support each other. This is how we as a community will continue to develop as well. Thanks, everyone.